Okay, good morning. My name is Kenneth Kolson. I'm a Fulbright Scholar this semester at Cholet University, and I've been asked to prepare a presentation having to do with the electoral systems that exist in the United States. There are some features of the American electoral system that I think are unique, and I intend to emphasize those this morning. Everything that has to do with government and politics in the United States can become very complicated, and the reason is that we have a federal system and 50 states in addition to the national government. So it's a fairly intricate system that needs some detail. I'm a political scientist by training. I've spent a great deal of my career in academic circumstances at a small college in Ohio, and more recently at a large university in Ohio, Ohio State University. For 22 years, I was deputy director for most of that time for research at the National Endowment for the Humanities, which is a small grant-making organization. It's an agency of the federal government that gets a congressional appropriation. The work of the National Endowment for the Humanities, or the NEH, is carried on out of the old post office building, which is pictured here. It's directly on Pennsylvania Avenue and 12th Street Northwest. It's one of the highlights, architectural highlights of Washington, D.C. It currently is undergoing restoration by Donald Trump, who intends to turn this into a five-star hotel. But for 22 years, I worked in this building for the NEH, which is now going to be moving elsewhere in the city. After retiring from the federal government in 2007, I joined the staff of the John Glenn School of Public Affairs. And just a word about Senator Glenn and the school. It's a very fine School of Public Affairs and Public Administration at Ohio State, which is in Columbus, Ohio, which is also the capital of the state. This is a picture of me with Senator Glenn and Mrs. Glenn, whose name is Annie. They're wonderful, wonderful people. People in Ohio think of the Glenns really as, well, they think of him as a senator because he was a member of the U.S. Senate for 24 years. Outside of Ohio, I think people still think of him as an astronaut first. But what he is, for those of us who have had the privilege of working with him, what he is an inspiration on a daily basis. We talk a lot about public service and the importance of public service at the Glenn School, and he's a model public servant, and he's an inspiration to us all. A couple of years ago, I applied to the Fulbright program, which is administered out of the State Department, the United States Department of State, and I applied for a grant to come and teach for a semester at Cholet University. And I was fortunate to have been awarded the grant, and I'm about halfway through the spring semester of 2014 right now. And I'm teaching two courses, one for BA students and the other for graduate students, having to do with public policy and analysis of public policy. So as I say, I'm a card-carrying political scientist, and it's been fun to teach in an external context or in a foreign context this semester. I have a great deal to learn from my students about Lithuania and Lithuanian history and government. Okay, what we're doing today is talking about the electoral system in the United States. And as I already indicated, it's a pretty complicated subject, in part because of our federal system. We have a national government which has its own details to be mastered. We also have 50 states, each of which is one way or another unique. At the national level, we have a legislature called the United States Congress, and the legislature consists of two houses, the House of Representatives, where members serve a 2-year term, which is not very long, and which is often the subject of complaints by members of the House that they have to constantly be running. Once they've been elected, they have to be constantly running for re-election, which means raising money, it means mounting a campaign, and it means constantly having to electioneer instead of actually, legislating or governing. The seats in the House of Representatives, the lower house, are apportioned by population. The large states like California or Texas get the most members of the House. Small states like Delaware or Rhode Island have a very minimal House delegation. And in some cases, I'm thinking of Wyoming, for instance, a big state but without many people. Wyoming has only a single member of the House, and it has, like every other state, 2 members of the Senate. So in some ways, it's actually more prestigious to be a member of the House from Wyoming because you have the whole state to worry about, just as the senators do. The upper chamber is called the United States Senate. Its seats are up every 6 years, and there are 2 senators per state, which means there's a total of 100 senators, 2 from each of the 50 states. For many, many years, members of the United States Senate were chosen by the states, by state legislatures. That was changed by the 17th Amendment to the Constitution fairly recently, in 1913. And since that time, all of the members of the United States Senate have to run for election, for a popular election, to be directly elected to that chamber. We also have an executive branch that is separate from the legislative branch, which is one of the distinctions of a presidential form of government and one of the ways in which it's different from parliamentary government or cabinet government, as they have, for instance, in Great Britain. The presidential term is 4 years, and for many, many years, we got along with the example of George Washington, set by George Washington. He retired after his 2nd term in the presidency. He was our first president, and no one had the nerve to depart from that precedent for a long time. But as you see, the 22nd Amendment was ratified in 1951, and there was an example that people wanted to resist, and that was the example of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was our president during the Great Depression and also during the Second World War. He was actually elected president 4 times. So he not only broke the George Washington's precedent and his record, but he was not just elected 3 times, but 4 times. He did not survive his last term of office. So for one reason or another, people thought it was a good idea to put into the Constitution a ban so that no other president in the future could break the 2-term limit rule. We also have a separate judiciary in the United States, and justices of the Supreme Court and other federal judges are appointed by a complicated process. They're nominated by the President of the United States, but they have to be approved by the Senate, which sometimes does and sometimes does not. They're appointed to office, and they hold office during good behavior. And good behavior is hard to define, but we've had really very few cases of impeachment having to do with the federal judiciary, and it's a branch that is less partisan. It's not completely nonpartisan, but less partisan than the other two more political elective offices or branches of the national government. But because of our federal system, and because we have 50 states, we have 50 different electoral systems. Each has its own legislature. Each state has its own governor. Each state has its own judges. These officers are selected or chosen by a number of different processes. Many of these offices are elective. At the local level, we have even an additional layer of complication because cities have their own city councils and their own mayors. They might have their own courts. States do have their statewide court systems. Towns, counties, school boards, and other local jurisdictions hold elections also. There are really thousands of different electoral systems in the United States. At the state level, it's a little hard to generalize, but let me give it a try. Of the 50 states, 49 have bicameral legislatures. And bicameral simply means a legislature with two chambers or two bodies, two houses, and houses that are usually selected, the members of which are usually selected in different ways. Lower house term is typically 2 years to try to keep the members of the lower house honest and to keep them attached. In the old days, it was keep them attached to the farm or keep them attached to their constituency, their district, and remind them often every 2 years that they have to continue to curry the favor of the voters. Seats in the state legislatures are usually assigned to geographical districts apportioned by population. And now apportionment is the question of how many members of the lower chamber do we need to represent the whole state. And apportionment is not exactly the same thing as districting, and we'll see an example of that in a minute. 15 of the 50 states have adopted term limits on members of their lower houses, and these limits come in various forms. But the idea of term limits to restrict the number of times a person can be elected and sent back to the lower house is an idea that has been gaining ground over the past couple of decades. All but one of the states have also an upper chamber, and these chambers are usually called state senates, and they're usually directly elected, and they're often elected by districts. Sometimes they're elected as for at-large seats, meaning that they represent the entire state. Typically, they're elected for 4-year terms. Occasionally, there are states that restrict the state senators to two-year terms, but 4-year terms is more common. And clearly, this is modeled after the national legislature, where the members of the upper house serve 6 years and the lower house only 2. Again, 15 states, the same states that have term limits on their lower house members, also have term limits on members of the upper chamber. Then there's the state governor, and all 50 states have an executive called the governor. Typically, these executives are chosen in elections that are held every 4 years. Sometimes the states will try to separate or insulate their own elections, their gubernatorial elections, from the national elections. And one way of doing that is by having them in different years. You probably know that we elect a president every 4 years, so they're even-numbered years. We did it most recently in 2012. We'll do it again in 2016, whether we're ready or not. But in order to prevent contagion or infection from the national political scene, some states like to have their elections for governor in either odd-numbered years or on the off years, the even-numbered but non-presidential years. 12 states have no term limits on their governors. The other 38 have adopted term limits of some kind. Typically, I think, limiting the governor from serving more than 2 terms. I live in Virginia, and the term limits in Virginia are particularly strict. A governor is not allowed to succeed himself or herself in the state of Virginia. After you've served for 4 years, you have to bow out. You can run again later and be elected again later, but you can't succeed yourself. Every state has a judicial branch, and these are very often held by judges for a fixed term of office, unlike the federal judges who serve during good behavior. Judges are sometimes appointed by governors. Sometimes they're appointed by legislatures. Sometimes it's a combination of the two, as it is at the presidential and national level, where a governor nominates and the legislature or the upper house of the legislature confirms. Sometimes judges at the state level are elected, and sometimes they're elected on nonpartisan ballots, which underscores the idea that judges should not be as deeply involved in the party systems as legislators or executives. But sometimes they're elected on partisan ballots as Democrats or as Republicans. And the argument for that usually is, well, you know, judges who are Democrats are different from judges that are Republicans. And this is a piece of information that voters need to know. If a candidate for the judiciary is a Republican or a Democrat, it's going to make some difference in his or her jurisprudence. Merit systems. In some states, people have been convinced, usually by the State Bar Association, that there should be experts involved in the selection of judges, that there should be people who are qualified to review the history of a candidate for a judgeship in terms of, you know, his or her knowledge of the law. Is he or she a good lawyer? Do they have the kind of jurisprudential temperament that we're looking for? Well, you know, in some cases, as I said, states have been persuaded that the professional lawyerly class, professional attorneys, ought to have a role in the naming, the appointment of judges. Nebraska is always an exception to every rule when it comes to state politics in the United States, because they don't have a bicameral legislature. They have a unicameral legislature. And I mention that, I bother to mention it because I know that Cholet has a sister city in the United States, and it is Omaha, Nebraska, home of Warren Buffett and of many other people. Okay, there are some distinctive features about U.S. elections that are worth knowing about. One is that our presidents are elected not by a direct vote of the people, but rather by an institution called an electoral college. which isn't a real college, but that's what it's called. It's a kind of a hypothetical meeting of electors who stand in for the popular voters. So I'll talk a little bit about the Electoral College in a minute, although it gets pretty complicated pretty fast. That's one distinctive feature of American elections, is that we elect our presidents indirectly using this device called the Electoral College. Also, we talk a lot about the right to vote. Those of us who believe in democratic government insist that there is a right to vote that shouldn't be violated by governments. But interestingly, if you look in the United States Constitution, it's sort of hard to find a right to vote. You can find in the first 10 amendments a lot of individual rights: a right to free speech, right to free press, a right to practice your religion. But nowhere in the Bill of Rights is there stipulated, nowhere in the Bill of Rights is a right to vote conferred upon any American citizen. There are references to a right to vote, usually negative references, since it's the states that determine who gets to vote and who is banned from voting. The language of the Constitution, and I'm going to cite the 15th Amendment here as a case in point, usually says that the states are not allowed to limit the right to vote for particular reasons. And the 15th Amendment was a post-Civil War amendment after slavery was abolished. The newly freed blacks in the South and in other parts of the country needed to be given rights or recognized, needed to have their rights recognized, which is what the 14th Amendment is all about. And the 15th Amendment says if states want to deny the right to vote to people on the, they might be able to do it, but they can't do it for reasons of race or color or previous condition of servitude. And that's the way that the right to vote is handled in the Constitution. And that, as far as I know, is uniquely American. We let the states apportion legislative seats and draw district boundaries. That's, I think, a unique feature of U.S. elections also. We elect almost all legislators from single-member constituencies. And this is a political science jargon, and so I'll apologize for it, but we talk a lot about single-member constituencies, meaning that there's a district, a geographical district, that is represented by a single member of the House of Representatives or the State House. And also, we have a first-past-the-post electoral system, which means you need to get more votes than anybody else in your district if you want to be elected to a particular legislative office. There's no partial representation. You either win your district or you lose it. You either win the whole thing or you lose the whole thing. It's a winner-take-all system. Another way of saying that is a zero-sum game. What you win if you win election to be a legislator in your state or in the U.S. House of Representatives is exactly what the other candidates lose. So there's a zero, you add it up, and there's a zero sum. Finally, I'll talk a little bit about primary elections. I think primary elections were invented in the United States. I'm pretty sure that they were invented in the Midwest during the Progressive era when people had more radical ideas about experimentation with the franchise, with voting, than we probably have now. But primary elections are a way for the political parties to nominate their candidates for public office. And as I said, I think we invented them. Start first with the Electoral College. There are 538 electoral votes. There is a presidential election. It happens in early November. People think that they go to the voting place and vote for Barack Obama or Mitt Romney. They don't, actually. They go and they vote for people who are pledged as electors to cast an electoral vote for Mitt Romney or Barack Obama. And this also is a winner-take-all game. If you win your state's popular vote, you win not some of the electoral votes, you win all of the electoral votes from your state. Now, there are two exceptions to that rule. One is Maine, and the other is Nebraska, of course, which do things differently. But the other 48 states reward the winning candidate with all of the state's electoral votes. How do you get 538 anyway? Well, you start with the 435 House seats, and there are 435 districts represented by members of the House of Representatives. And then you add the 100 senators, or the seats anyway, and then finally you add 3 votes, 3 electoral votes that are guaranteed to the District of Columbia by the 23rd Amendment. I'm pretty sure that's right. So you get a total of 538, and the Constitution says pretty explicitly that the winner of a presidential election has to get more than half the votes, which means 538 divided by 2 plus 1. The winning candidate has to get 270 votes, or the election is thrown into the House of Representatives. This happened in the election of 1800, and it revealed a flaw in the Constitution which had to be corrected, so that the problem in the election of 1800 is that people thought they were voting for Thomas Jefferson, but Aaron Burr, who was his running mate for the vice presidency, understood, he was a clever man, and he understood a subtlety in the system, and he used it to his advantage to have that election thrown into the House. If a presidential election is thrown into the House, each state casts 1 vote. And unfortunately, it's usually the case that there are 3 or 4 or 5 states that have evenly divided delegations. They might have 10 members of the House altogether. 5 of them are Republicans, 5 of them are Democrats. How is a state in a situation like that to cast a ballot for president? Well, it's a system that's begging to be abused, and as long as we have it and don't correct it, there's always the risk of an election being thrown into the House where there's great potential for hanky-panky or for cheating or for bribes to be offered and accepted. The key thing to understand about the Electoral College, it's extremely complicated, but the key point is that it was never adopted as part of our constitutional system for elitist reasons. No one had the idea that you can't trust people to vote, so we need to have a sort of an aristocratic chamber to second guess the people in case they make a mistake. Nobody really thought that. It just seemed to be a clever way of including the states in the presidential election without sending it to the state legislatures, which would have also been a mess. So it's a curious institution that is archaic, in some ways outdated, but you know, it hasn't worked too badly, actually, over the 200-plus years. In 2012, the electoral votes were distributed this way. The blue states went for Obama, the Democrat, the pinkish or reddish states voted for the Republican Mitt Romney. There were a few states that were really, really critical, none more so than my great state of Ohio, which cast 18 votes, having 16 members of the House plus its 2 senators, cast its 18 votes for Barack Obama. That plus the 13 votes out of Virginia made Obama the winner of the electoral vote. You'll notice there's no third-party candidate here. There are only 2 parties, and I'm going to have a few words to say about that in a minute. So the seats are apportioned by the states, and they're apportioned to the states. The population of Ohio is shrinking, so although it has 18 popular votes right now, or 18 electoral votes right now, after the census in 2020, it might have fewer than that. But once you've apportioned the seats, state by state, the legislatures get into the business of districting. There was one of the founding fathers was a man from Massachusetts named Elbridge Gerry. And Elbridge Gerry had the Massachusetts legislature carve out a district for himself that included all of the members of his own party and very few of the members of the other party. I can't remember if he was a Federalist or a Republican. But Elbridge Gerry became famous because of this cartoon, which shows some kind of sea serpent or salamander, and that's what his district looked like, and it became known as a gerrymander, or a gerrymander is the way most people say it, a reference to this manipulation of elections by manipulating the boundaries of congressional or legislative districts. It really happens in real life. Congressional District 12, which is in North Carolina, or North Carolina District 12, is a good example of a district that's been drawn for the purpose of partisan advantage. In Ohio, I mentioned that we have a shrinking population, and so in the last election, the Ohio legislature had to redistrict for Congress, for the U.S. House, and it did so, since it was controlled by Republicans at the time, it did so by confining as many of the state's Democratic voters as they could into a very small number of districts. I think as I recall, there are maybe 5 Democrats in the Ohio delegation, and that's because they almost have no opposition in their districts. If you can squeeze all of your opponents into a small number of districts, you can compete in all of the other districts that haven't been manipulated in that way. Maurice Duverger, who is pretty close to 100 years old now, wrote a book in the late 40s and early 1950s called Political Parties. Everything that I know about political parties and election systems, I learned from Maurice Duverger. I think he's a judge or some kind of an official in France still at the age of 97. I tip my cap to him. Political Parties is a great book because it broke new ground in political science and opened up a subject that I hadn't even known existed. I read it 50 years ago, and I still keep it on my bookshelves because it's a very, very handy volume. Duverger was a Frenchman. He was a graduate student in the late 40s. and he got to watch the French Fourth Republic up close and personal, as we say in the United States. The Fourth Republic, France, was a very unstable, notoriously unstable government. Italy at the time, also highly unstable, with coalition governments being formed and reformed every 6 months or so, which is a lot. What Duverger taught us all is that there's a relationship between electoral laws and party systems. That if you have single-member districts, as we do in the United States, you're likely to get, and these are zero-sum elections or winner-take-all elections, you're likely to end up with a two-party system. And in the United States, we have a pretty darn stable two-party system. If you have an electoral system that's more like proportional representation, where people vote for a party slate, and if 20% of the people vote for a particular party's slate of candidates, then 20% of the seats in Parliament are allocated to that party. That's what's proportional about a PR system or proportional representation. Well, if you have laws that try to provide proportional representation, you're going to have a multi-party system. You're going to have more than two. So Duverger's law is a principle which asserts that plurality rule elections structured within single-member districts tends to favor a two-party system. This is one of two hypotheses proposed by Duverger, the second stating that the double ballot majority system and proportional representation, which are different things but sometimes related, these tend to produce multi-party systems. It's really all about timing, the timing of coalition formation. In single-member districts, plurality election systems, coalitions form early so that the parties are broadly based, mainstream usually in terms of policy and in terms of ideology. Proportional representation systems, however, encourage late coalition formation, even at the point of forming a government. And that's why the Fourth Republic in France was so notoriously unstable, because of their election laws. Now you might say, well, yeah, but the election laws are determined by the culture of a society. And that's true. I mean, it's a chicken and an egg kind of proposition. And some countries seem to prefer unstable governments. In the United States, one great advantage to our system is that it has, as I've said, been pretty darn stable over the years. We did have a civil war, and it was a bloody one. But for the most part, our system has served us fairly well. There are certain ballot issues that I wanted to discuss only briefly. We take the Australian ballot for granted these days. The Australian ballot is just another term for secret ballots. If you're going to have a secret ballot, you need to have the government print a ballot and distribute them officially in an official polling place. But that's a fairly new idea. It's a 19th century idea. It came out of Australia. And in the United States in the 19th century, we didn't have this. Ballots were printed by the political parties. They were called tickets. And the idea was that the parties encouraged voters to vote a straight ticket or a straight party ballot. And that's how they enforced it, by printing these tickets and making sure everybody had one, making sure your people had one. The other people we're not going to worry about. Well, interestingly, there are two kinds of ballots that can be printed by the state. One is called the office block ballot, which encourages office by office, one at a time voting. And then there's the party column ballot, which encourages you to check a box at the top to vote for an entire slate. These things obviously are also related to single-member districts versus proportional representation, which almost always uses a party column ballot. Whoops. Here's an office block ballot from 2012 in Virginia. This is a sample ballot. You can see you vote for governor. Terry McAuliffe was the winner of this election. The Democrat, Ken Cuccinelli, was the loser. I guess Robert C. Sarvis was a libertarian candidate, and I've never heard of him. I don't think he did too well. After you vote for governor, though, then you vote for lieutenant governor. If you want a Democrat in the governor's office, but you want a Republican as a lieutenant governor because you like the idea of frustration and perversion, well, you can do that. And you can vote for a Democrat for attorney general or a Republican, and you can slice the bologna any way you want, I guess, is the thing, if you're using an office block ballot. If you're using a party ticket or party column ballot, you're probably not going to go through this one by one. You're probably going to succumb to the temptation to just make an X up at the top, and in this case, vote for the purple party or Group B, and as opposed to the no fun party, which is Group A, and I don't know who's ever going to vote for them. Then finally, there are primary elections. I've already said a word about primaries. There are different ways that parties can use to nominate their candidates. And we've got two parties, two major parties, the Republicans and the Democrats. In the early days, the nominations were done by congressional delegations in a system that used the term caucus. Republicans or Federalists in the legislature will get together and nominate people they like for popular election. That was gradually replaced. People complained about King Caucus. It seemed awfully elitist. It was gradually replaced in the 19th century by conventions, where people are elected by the party to go to the state capitol or wherever to hold a convention to nominate members of their party for public office. But that came into disrepute late in the 19th century, which is about the time when primary elections, the progressive period, when primary elections became very popular. They were adopted, statewide primaries were adopted first in Wisconsin, which was, and really still is in some ways, a notoriously progressive state. In 1903, there was a progressive politician named Robert La Follette in Wisconsin who encouraged his state, he was governor, to adopt primary elections so that members of his party, the Republican Party, could choose their own candidates. There are different kinds of primary elections. There are closed primaries. You have to be a registered Democrat to vote in the Democratic primary, or you have to be a registered Republican, and you have to register earlier, and you can't register that day. Open primaries are, just as the term implies, much more open to people's whimsy. You might decide on one day that you're not a Democrat anymore, you're a Republican, and so you want to vote in the Republican primary, and open primary laws allow you to do that. Then there are blanket primaries, which allow you to pick and choose between the parties. If you can't make up your mind, you can vote for a Republican candidate for governor, but Democratic candidate for the legislature. You can pick and choose. And there have only been a few cases of real blanket primaries. but they tend to lead to chaos. But those are some of the distinctive features of the U.S. electoral system. I thank you for your time. I thank Cholet University and the Distance Learning Center for making this occasion possible and for facilitating it. And I thank you for your attention.